Okay, thank you everyone for coming this evening. I'm Manisha Verghese, I'm the curator of the AA's public program, and I'm delighted tonight to welcome FALA Atelier to give a lecture at the AA. As they describe themselves, they work with methodical optimism on a wide range of projects from territories to birdhouses. But tonight, as I've been explained, we're going to have an unusual lecture that's going to be more, as the title suggests, on tropes, or rather themes. Running through all of their projects, so we'll see things popping up here and there that they will explain more about at the start of the lecture. Just to tell you a bit about them, they're based in Oporto and they're led by, and you'll have to excuse me for my terrible pronunciation of their names, but it's led by Filipe Magalhães, trying, Luisa Soares, and Ahmed Belkhodja. And to tell you a bit more about each of them, Filipe graduated in architecture at the Architecture School of Porto and in Ljubljana, and he had a thesis titled Between the Abstract and the Figurative. He's worked for various offices, including Harry Gugger in Basel and SANAA in Tokyo. Luisa graduated in architecture also from the same school in Porto and Tokyo University. Her thesis was titled The Matter of Ideas. And she's also worked for Harry Gugger in Basel and for Toyo Ito in Tokyo. Ahmed graduated from the ETH in Zurich and also studied between Lausanne, Gothenburg, and Singapore. He's worked also for Harry Gugger in Basel and Ober Architects in New York, as well as Atelier in Tokyo. So tonight's lecture is now in the hands of Filipe, and then afterwards we'll have a few questions, and I hope you'll join us for a more informal conversation over drinks to follow that. So please join me in welcoming FALA Atelier.
Hello? Done, okay. So, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be able to present our work, even more in such a school. It's a real pleasure for us. And as you said, it's going to be an unusual lecture. We were wondering on how to address our work in a different manner for this lecture, and you will see that it's not the most comfortable one. If you don't pay attention, there's a chance you will lose it at some point. But I think it will create a more intriguing set of questions in the end, because it's going to be a little bit provocative. And it starts with our About page in our website. In the last 3-4 years, there have been maybe 5-6 versions of it. Very long, very detailed, aiming at a precision that we could not actually have at the time. Young offices tend to do that. But this kind of exercise of reduction in our About led us to 2 keywords, naïve and architecture. And maybe these 2 words will disappear also with time and will be replaced by some other words. But at this time, I think they fit us quite well. They somehow summarize everything we want to do and how we want to do it. And this reduction process is part of a kind of checkpoint moment we are living right now. We have been working together for 3.5 years, more or less. We have been producing almost 80 projects, many competitions, a couple of private projects also, a few installations. And we are at a moment where, after years of experimentation, we have several construction sites ongoing. We are moving slowly from a small scale of renovations to new buildings, or buildings built from scratch. And at this moment, we are somehow trying to understand what we achieved so far, so what we have been doing in the last couple of years. So about 1 year ago, we started a research, a kind of self-centered research on what we produced so far, and we decided to redraw all the plans of all the projects we did it to this moment at the same scale, in the same line thicknesses, and this was the beginning of a research that will have its first expression today in the form of a lecture, and soon in the form of our first publication. And it's a research that is very ambitious. It's a research that somehow is structured by some sort of personal understanding of what architecture theory is for us. And we see it as a kind of daily necessity, you know, like a shower. You need a little bit of it every day. And we have reasons to believe it makes our days better. And it's a moment where we are looking back at our references, at what we built, at where we are now. And today's lecture is called Tropes, but more than addressing tropes literally, one trope at a time, making a list and just keep going and going and going. What we decided to do was to be a little bit more, to give it a few steps back and look at these tropes in themes, in topics, in five main groups, and to address somehow all our projects without talking about any project at all. So what I'm going to try to do today is to talk about each of these topics and subtopics, and all of them will be addressing, maybe one plan will show now and one elevation will show later, and some projects will show up only once, other projects will show 5, 6 times, but every time the project will show, it will be addressing a different theme. So, as I said, it's an experimental lecture, so let's see how it works out. Roots and heroes. Everyone needs to start somewhere, and we need to start where we started. How did we get here? Circumstance plays a key role in our existence so far. There are a series of moments that, if we would go back in time, meant nothing, but when we now look at them in perspective, they have a very strong importance. They are very, very important for what we achieved so far. Of course, when they were happening, few people understood, mostly the three of us, that they were somehow defining what was coming ahead. But we are the sum of all the events, all the places, and all the things we saw, and the books we read, and the movies we watched, and so on and so forth. So at the time, we were not understanding which ones were actually changing everything. But we started, as Manashe said, by studying in different schools: Porto, Ljubljana, Tokyo, Zurich, FL, Singapore. We worked in different offices between Switzerland, New York, Tokyo. We had very different personal experiences. Of course, some of them were stronger than others, and if you live for 1 year in 6 square meters, that kind of leaves an imprint. But this is where we are now. We are in a small room in Porto. It's about 25 square meters, not that big. We work all around the same table. We sit 8 people there. And this is how it usually looks like. It's very messy. This was not a planned photo, it was just a photo. You can see the laptops, the tea mugs, the cables everywhere. There are some books, some notebooks. It's what it is. It's a kind of chaotic understanding of an office. It's very informal, actually. But it's home. It's where we feel comfortable. It's where we produce architecture, let's say. And it's a very risky office. We are all very young. I'm the oldest in the office, I'm 29, and we go down until, 21 years old collaborators. We have many different nationalities, from a few people from Porto, of course, to people from deep Siberia. We have different backgrounds. Not all of us studied in the same schools with the same approaches, so you can imagine discussing a project with such a young and diverse team is quite something. And I think the architecture reproduces somehow a direct reflection of exactly that. Me and Ahmed share the fact that for a quite substantial period of our lives, we lived in Japan. And as I said, some of the experiences we had there were quite intense. Living in the Nakagin was one of them. But living in Japan is it can change you. It can change you in many ways, not only for the social experiences you might have, but for the buildings you might visit, be them highly traditional or highly revolutionary. And in Japan, you are surprised every day. There's always something you find out that you didn't know you were looking for. And Japan was a very important place, not only for us, but for many other architects in the 20th century, from Rossi to Corbusier to Frank Lloyd Wright to Valerio Giatti. A lot of them had their own life-changing moment in Japan, and we feel that in our case it somehow was probably one of the first moments that changed the rules forever. Nothing was the same again. And it's very interesting for us to see that 70, 60 years before we even started a practice, Portuguese architects that had the chance to travel to Japan, like in this case Fernando Távora, were able to absorb what we were absorbing at the time, digest it, and buildings that and propose new forms of what they understood, and buildings that we had known for so long suddenly made a new sense, because suddenly we were reading in them artifacts, motifs, moments that clearly were coming from a place we didn't know before. And we are always, always, always collecting. We are always stealing. Caesar says that we are many things because we can control it. Since the day we are born, we start collecting images all the time, grabbing and grabbing and grabbing. Since the day we are born until the day we die, but we don't collect them in an order. We don't collect them alphabetically or chronologically. We just keep adding more and more information to our library. And at some point when we are confronted with some sort of problem, with a challenge, with a project, with a question, we need to stabilize the images we have in our heads, and we need to decide what we want to use, what we want to omit, what we want to impose, if we want to scream, if we want to put some images in the back and others in the front. And in that sense, every time we do a project, the project is not really an invention, it's not really something that was born out of nothing. It's more of a collection of images we collected before that then we organize as a curatorial statement in the shape of an imaginary museum. So every time we are actually proposing something, we are making a kind of homage to some of our heroes, even if we don't actually know we are actually doing it. And when we did our first project, we were very literal about it. We were asked to design a library in a very vague plot in Setúbal. And we took, of course, the library, the first library that came to our minds, that was the Asplund Library in Stockholm. And we took the Pantheon and we just mixed them together. So we just took two masterpieces, we decided to abstract them a bit and create a very strange object. I don't think anyone reads the Pantheon here, but we were young, and this idea of appropriation and this idea of stealing from our references and applying again over and over again was still at the start. We were not in control completely of our capacity, so we were just trying to experiment. But it was a very radical project and we were very happy with it. So as the time passed, there were other times where we made similar experiments. When we were asked for the Chicago Biennial to design for a competition, a kiosk, probably the less relevant program ever, we couldn't stop looking. I mean, it was supposed to be in the Chicago lakefront. We couldn't stop looking at Mies and the glass box, at Shinohara and the traditional Japanese wooden roof, at Asplund and the meaning that the roof can have, and how it is or is not what you see from the outside on the inside. And we were convinced at the time, again, that we were producing a very small masterpiece, that we were somehow copying very clearly, deliberately, but we were achieving something that if we were not there to produce, it would have never existed. So if in one sense we were actually collecting from someone else, in reality we were also producing a mixture that was so unique that the three of us, or the office, was responsible for. So no one sees Mies, Shinohara or Asplund anymore, it becomes somehow FALA. And as this projects kept happening and we started having different kinds of commissions, we understood in the most humble refurbishments that most of the spaces we were producing were in our heads new, were fresh, they were ours. But in reality, they have been there in the back of our minds for a very, very long time. And even the small anecdotes, like a hood for a kitchen, could have been quoted from someone else, that could be already quoting someone else. And probably no one living in that apartment will ever understand that this guy in Berlin actually did that thing that had an influence on someone else, that had an influence on us. But for us, it was very nice to see that these things could happen quite naturally. So even if it's just as small objects, small geometrical creations, they could be connected somehow to very important pieces of architecture history. And even when we are now designing, we cannot, even today, this is a very recent project, we cannot stop looking at references. And even if it's not exactly the same, and as Nago Vender probably would do it much better than we do, we can still see that the language and what we want to drain from these references is very present on what we are doing. And it's not about copying per se the form, it's about extracting some sort of essence and applying that essence, like a magnifying effect. So imagine that you use as a reference a building from last year. It's possible that you will be copying its form, its shape, its color, its material. If you use a reference as, I don't know, Bramante, I doubt anyone is going to be doing the same ornament on the columns, for example. So, again, we are always trying to extract as much as possible from these references, but without being didactical or literal about it. And it's as important in an office to understand what you want to do as it is to understand what you don't want to do, to understand what you care about and what you don't care about, to understand what interests you and what doesn't interest you. So it's very important to be selective about what you will ignore, about what will you make an headline with, or what you would never talk about with a client, with a friend, with a colleague. And some ideas, they don't have scale, and that's a good thing. They don't have a site. They are somehow timeless. And others are not built. You know, the metabolist movement never built anything, but still it's taught in every architecture school. Super Studio, Archizoom, pretty much the same. So it's interesting to see that this kind of utopian projects, these utopian movements, they had such an impact without ever existing as a building. And still we see them as important references, because although with time we are slowly introducing more and more construction in our practice, and even if some of them are small constructions and refurbishments, this backbone of utopia, it's very important for us. So it has been very present in the beginning with competitions that were literally utopian visions for social housing of the future, but it has been present in small-scale projects where several of these concepts, from Archizoom to Super Studio, for example, this idea of occupation of the super platform, of the super surface, were attracting us for such a long time that when we were invited to design our first house, that is actually built, and the client being a bird doesn't make it less of a house, it was fantastic for us to see that what we were doing was a kind of three-dimensional superstructure, where in each level we were placing a totem that related to a function that somehow suggested a use for the bird. And birds are very demanding clients. They have needs. They get sad if they are alone, so it's good to have a mirror so that they feel company. They have company. They eat outside, they don't eat in the nest, so they need a place to eat, a kind of dining room. They don't brush their teeth, but they need to sharpen their beak, so they need a stone that is hard enough so that they can do it. And they can have one empty module where they can gather some friends and talk about bird stuff. And it was very nice, because this project happened after an invitation for an exhibition, and the birds were very curious about it. They were always looking at it and wondering how would it be. But what was funny is that this project is by far the smallest project we built so far. It's more or less this size, but it's probably the most ambitious one. In a very elegant way, it summarizes what I would call the humble handbook of architecture by FALA. You know, like everything that we try to achieve in the projects we do is somehow summarized in this proposal. But one might say that this is just a birdhouse. How does this apply in a real context? This is a building we are refurbishing in Porto, in Lisbon. It's an 18th century building, very old, very big, quite fantastic. And you can see that the existing condition was giving some clues about a sort of spatial structure that we emphasized by removing the walls that were in the middle of this spatial grid and adding just a couple of them. The ones that were added, of course, followed different geometries because we don't want them to collide or to be misunderstood as previous existing walls. But the way how we see this is as an architecture of rooms. And although we have, I don't know, 30 rooms in this plan, if it had 2,000, 10 million, it doesn't matter. The principle of the architecture in this project is parametric to some extent, because we define a set of rules for these rooms where the existing openings would keep blue elements to divide them from the next ones, and new openings would get pink doors. And although we had, as I said, maybe 40 rooms per floor, and it's like 5 floors, all the rooms are the same, but all the rooms are different depending on the occupant. A little bit like the birdhouse. Each floor has one totem, and each totem suggests a use. So if I take this guy from this image and I put it on this one, so the living room becomes the bedroom, and the bedroom becomes the living room. And this principle is what guides the project. It's not really the design, as I said, it's parametric. We just define a set of rules and we accept the results that come with it. And of course, the user will play a key role in the activation of these spaces. But if utopia is granted, we also live with a lot of limitations. We are a young office in a post-crisis market in Portugal. In 2007, the crisis was very, very strong. And since then, we started, mostly in Lisbon and Porto, a gentrification process that is provoking a kind of typological Armageddon all over the two main cities, where tourists became the clients. Whatever decision is made in any way, it's about making the tourist happy. If the tourist is happy, good. If it's not, the decision doesn't go through. So we found ourselves coming back from Switzerland and Japan in a moment where this gentrification process was at its peak. So all the projects that were available for us to work in were actually projects like clients buying a small apartment in Lisbon and wanting to make an Airbnb apartment out of it. And that was fine. I mean, it was our first project. Anything would be funny for us to do. But then there was the second project where another client bought an apartment to do an Airbnb apartment out of it. And then, okay, 2 in a row, why not? And as these projects were happening, we were experimenting with them because the fact that they were, let's say, our clients were investors, they were not the most interesting people in the world. They didn't really care about architecture at all. But they allowed us to try things. They allowed us to not be boring, to try to find a meaning, even in the small decisions, in the choice of colors, in the choice of materials, in the spatial structures, that could mean something for us. And then there was the first project, as you can guess, again, Airbnb apartment. And as the projects kept progressing, we were becoming more and more ambitious. And despite the fact that some of them were very, very small, like this is a 60 square meters apartment, our goal was to make the most out of them, and the transformations were becoming more and more radical. And at some point, as someone stated once, your renovations, they don't look renovations. If you don't tell us that they are inside an old building, they feel like new constructions. And that was probably the best thing they could ever told us. And as the projects were evolving, the way how we projected ourselves in the spaces and now we imagine the spaces being occupied was actually going further also. So instead of using wood planks, we started using big plywood panels in some projects, proposing a bedroom without a bed, bringing again a little bit of Japan to a small apartment in Lisbon. We were having the chance to design furniture, to work with marble companies, with metal companies to produce something that we believed could be a closet 2.0, something that could combined with the project make much more sense than a standard IKEA solution. As this project kept accumulating and accumulating, we were asked to refurbish our first building. And a full building has, even in such an urban context, had something that we never worked with before. It had a facade, it had a public expression. For the first time, we had to say something to the city. We had the opportunity to do something that anyone could see, not only the people going there for an Airbnb apartment. And it was a very interesting process, but as you can imagine, inside we had Airbnb apartments again. So this was a single family house that was transformed into 5 apartments. And although they were slightly different because of the staircase and the volume and the access and the roof, in the end, this collage could be for any of them. It could be for the ground floor, the first floor, it doesn't really matter. The point was that we felt the need to, while moving from 1 to 5 apartments, or maybe one day to 50 or 100, that there would be some sort of key idea structuring the project. And in this case, this was a very functional one. A few months later, we were commissioned to do another one, exactly the same principle, several apartments in an old single-family house. And if the first one was somehow modern, pragmatic, following some sort of rational principle, the second one was quite the opposite, quite formal, quite liberating, I would say. And the third one, of course, was about some sense of absolute space. How could we work in a space that has 4 functions but no wall? How could we organize it? And this element of the column played a key role. These projects kept expanding, and at some point we also noticed that another kind of market that exists in Portugal is the cheap architecture market. So if you have a low budget and you want to do a project, we are good contenders for that project because we are a young office, so we are probably cheaper than Caesar or so to the more. So we had our first private clients that would actually live in the space we were going to design, but the space they bought was a garage. So they asked us to work with it and to design a house in a garage, and it was one of the funniest projects we did so far. And they were also very good clients, it's important to say. They were open for the discussion, and they were open to accept our inputs and to accept that they were going to live inside one idea. They were not living in a garage. The project was defined together with them as one very strong idea, and they tagged along with it. So it also had a facade, but probably the most discreet facade we will ever design. And today these projects, these very, very cheap projects are taking us in other directions, like how to transform an old clothing factory into a housing unit. And the limitations lead us again to some sort of parametric principle where there's no real choice of finishes and materials. It's very dry, but the way how we design the space defines all the rules. So the project comes almost out of a couple of lines of text and a plan. But I will talk about the plan a little bit later. And the few elements we can expose, we do, and the elements we add, they always have a strong connotation, either the blue doors or the windows with the cross. But this is the project. But what we understood was our biggest limitation was the fact that most of the people we work with, I would say 75 of our clients, they don't really care about what we do. They don't care about architecture. They are not educated to understand architecture. So we many times have to disguise our arguments with some sort of pseudo-aesthetical arguments, like we need to convince them to do something based on fake arguments so that we can progress with our own private agenda. But we are fine with that. We don't mind that. It's we believe we are doing a good work, and we believe they are getting good projects. So, but what we find is that it's somehow liberating also to be able to do this. And at this stage in the office, it's very funny to be able to transform these buildings and to create new buildings without the limitations that a traditional client could bring most of the times. And as you notice, I talk a lot about transformation. I talk a lot about refurbishments, about the context. And nostalgia and the lack of it is a topic. So how do we operate in such a context? As you can imagine, Portugal is a very conservative country. It loves the concept of heritage. Anything that is old stays. It doesn't need to be even interesting. The laws of the municipalities protect anything that is older than 50 years. So many times it's quite complicated to even negotiate with them anything. But while we are in school, most of the time we are taught to build from scratch. We are taught to design museums. We are taught to sometimes even design airports. But let's be honest, we are not going to design any airport during our whole life. But we might refurbish a few apartments and build a few houses and maybe one day design a school that maybe will take 0.01% of us to an airport. But we need to accept that this was the context we found. And as you see, most of the interventions we did were very radical. Not radical in the architecture itself, but mostly on the technical side, how to completely demolish a 200-year-old structure and introduce life into it, and how to deal with buildings that had some sense of some potential, you know, because some buildings, they had nothing. It doesn't matter if they are old or not. You open the door and there's nothing you can work with. But other buildings, they have these beautiful plaster ceilings. They have an interesting spatial structure. Like in this one, you see the free rooms in the bottom and the top and the one on the right. They were majestic rooms with 3.5 meter ceiling heights, beautiful ceilings, beautiful windows, tall windows. But at the same time, in the back here, there was so many interventions along the years that something was lost. So we are not dogmatic about it. If there's something that should remain, it remains. So some of our interventions were kind of 50-50 invention and refurbishment, let's say. So there was a part that was preserved and we try to emphasize its qualities, so a more symmetrical, classical side of the living room. And there was the new side that had to be invented, that had to be created from scratch because there was nothing we could work with there. So the tension between these two attracts us a lot. And as I said, municipalities, they tend to protect anything that is old, but mostly if it's on the public side. If the public can see it, they will fight for it. So many times refurbishing and changing and adulterating a facade means in Porto only changing the tiles, because we need to keep the material, we cannot touch the granite, we cannot add or close openings. But when it comes to back facades, they are more liberal because no one sees them. So it's not really heritage if no one sees it, so do whatever you want. And that's what we many times do. We see the back facade as an opportunity to create a new main facade. So despite the fact that one side is facing the street and the other side is usually facing a private courtyard, the hierarchy of the building is not defined just by that. And we see an opportunity in this back facade. And other times we have projects that even the client suggests to be very radical and to completely transform the space, like a garage that becomes an apartment, and then we feel that actually no, actually this was probably the project where we were most respectful about the context we found, because nothing changed, nothing at all changed. And as a starting point, it's kind of contradictory to not change at all the space that the clients expected the most to be transformed. And as I said again, this question of the facade and how to deal with it leads us to funny experiments like how to question the tile. Tile is a very typical material in Portugal and it's very local. Everyone ends up working with it sooner or later, but usually it's used in a pattern. It's used in a repetition. And we try to wonder, what if we used the same tiles that the city has seen 1 million times, but in a different manner, and we create our own constellation. And we collaborated with the Polish tile artist based in Porto, Paulina, and the result was very funny. And it's nice to pass by and to see the reactions from the people that walk around, like there's something weird about this. And as I said, front facades always protected, so most of the times we can change the tiles or the material in between the granite elements, but let's be honest, they stay pretty much the same in terms of their structure, of their openings, of their expression. But the back facades, they open a field for experimentation. So we can be very humble about it or very radical, or I don't know how to label the third one. But we see, as I said, an opportunity in the back. And when we talk about nostalgia, it's also important to talk about context, because these are all buildings that already exist, so talking about nostalgia is easy. But in this case, this was the first house we designed from scratch, not for a bird, for actual people. And the context was the least interesting context possible. You can see on the side plan that all the houses are more or less the same relation to the street. They are always looking at the street from the side. And we felt that we didn't want to belong to that context, so the whole the whole design was based on the principle that the house would be facing a very arbitrary axis, this diagonal north-south, that would detach itself from the neighbors, and it would have a face, it would have a kind of positive attitude towards the public space. It would say hello, contrary to the other ones that are not polite houses at all. This one is proud of being there, and this was the first time we had to build something from scratch in a not so interesting context, so it was important for us to make it a statement somehow. And architecture is always between the abstract and the figurative. The most abstract project you can imagine, or the most figurative one, will never actually touch the ends of the spectrum. They will always be somewhere in between. So most of our references are always between those two edges. And there are some themes that we like to work with, and as an example, I'm going to use the sloped roof for this topic, that can become the whole structure of the project, like this very imponent structure with 3 roofs, or it can become just a part of an inside joke, the mixture between a very modern glass box and a very traditional Japanese wood roof. Or even better, this one, the factory again, where the client built this in the late 80s as a clothing factory. But according to his words, he made it look like a house so that it would integrate in the context. And we don't find it that interesting at all. We told him that as a house it was a complete disaster. So we felt that it was funny that now that this factory was going to be transformed into a housing unit, that it could feel like the factory that it never was. So the factory looked like a house, but the house now looks like a factory, which is quite something. And other projects that we designed from scratch but were meant to be never built, like this one, the office tower we will never need. At some point we don't know how to classify them between this idea of abstraction and figuration. But what is very important for us is that although the forms and the expressions and the materials and the colors and the philosophies behind each one of these projects might vary, there's a kind of consistency that flows through them. And the fact that we have for example, a big dome that defines this library space with zenithal skylights, and then we have a different form but the same idea, connects these two projects in the same way that certain forms connects these two, and this idea of a wood structure behind a brick wall is again visible on this building that has everything built in wood, but the facade is very majestic and in stone. So these themes, they run through the project, and sometimes it's easy to mix or to merge the idea of form with the idea of an idea, but for us it's very clear what is what, and we like to actually find out that the same idea can produce very different expressions of architecture. Rhetorics. Plans. We always start with plans, because plans are facts, they are dry, they can be measured, they can be read. You can take a plan and narrate it, write a text, and someone else can draw exactly the same plan afterwards. A plan has no language. You can take a plan anywhere in the world and everyone is going to be able to fully understand it. And this is a great example, probably one of the best plans of the 20th century. And as I said before, a few months ago, we started to redraw all our plans. So these are only the plans of the buildings that we have either built or under construction. So the buildings that will exist physically. And we designed them all at the same scale we drew them all at the same scale so that we could compare them and so that we could understand that at some point there are some themes that start appearing and then repeating themselves, so that at some point we could compare different projects to the same program, always at the same scale, so that we could compare similar ideas in different projects, so that we could somehow have an overview over our production and understand when did we start to do a certain motif or a certain form or a certain space, or to discuss a certain idea, and how many times that idea was repeated, and so on and so forth. And we started understanding there are several themes that fascinate us, like this idea of a main wall that divides what is public from what is private on a house, or this idea of proposed pleasantry, a kind of hidden mistake, like the central column that is not central, the unexpected geometry that guides you from entrance to the living room, or the missing walls that, of course, did not respect existing grid. Or sometimes we have buildings that have such a strong modern feeling that we just respect their structure to define the programs. Other times, the legal implications the municipalities force us to keep elements that we don't want to keep. So by doing so, we react to them by somehow proposing a kind of anti-modern manifesto, a very formal one indeed. And what is really important for us is that a plan is built as one system. So the plan cannot suffer small changes. We cannot just go there and move a wall a little bit and adjust to fit a cabinet and do, no. A plan is a system, and it's either designed all at once and it works as one object, or it doesn't. If the client is not happy with the plan, we do a new one, but we don't correct, you know, like with a pencil, we erase a little bit and draw the wall a little bit on the side. And as you can see, all the walls have a certain tension and a certain intention. So they come from a series of rules that we invented, and they define a spatial condition that, again, if we were not the ones designing it, would never exist. So it's not saying that it's the best spatial structure possible. It's saying that it's a unique one. It's one that belongs to us. And as you notice, grids are very important for us, and the motifs we apply on top of them also, because grids allow a certain detachment. When you want to exhibit, for example, the Nakagin in an old palace in Lisbon, the grid is a tool that allows us to somehow be independent. It's a tool that relates to the content. It's a tool that relates to the space in a way that it could be there, it could be anywhere else. Again, it's endless. We had, I don't know, 60 modules, but we could have 1 million. The principle would be the same. And this is my favorite photo from the exhibition, where you really feel what the grid allowed us to do, and this structure and this concept for the exhibition, to really say, this is where our exhibition ends and where the palace begins. And the grid can also have some sort of programmatic feeling. So as I said before, you can have the grid supporting functions that, in this case, has 4 levels, but could have, again, 1 million. And each one of the floors has the totem and so on. And the grid can also be given. It's like, this is the biggest refurbishment we have ongoing so far, where you have a very modern building from the 50s. And this is what we found. But the analysis of the plans showed us that behind all the walls that were somehow misleading us, there was a very strong structural system that, of course, we worked with, because, as I said, sometimes the buildings that, you can imagine, this is a modern building. It's not that loved in Porto, because we Portugal, tends to appreciate the old more than the modern. So for us, it was interesting to just play with the fact that we were working on a modern structure and accept that it produces a certain kind of space that those buildings that everyone likes don't produce. And if the structure has an impact on the design of the project, the structural elements that subsist should have some sort of expression in the space. Even when you isolate your room and you somehow enclose your private space, you still have the feeling that these very strong and oversized beams are there always with you. Grids can also be didactic. So you can have a grid that relates to structure and the grid that relates to space. And by somehow detaching, by liberating one from another, you create a different kind of tension. This was a competition proposal, but it's a theme that we have been exploring now in new projects, where the grid or the system that organizes the space has nothing to do with the grid that actually holds the building. Again, the grid that was incomplete, but was completed with elements that collide with the existing structure. And finally, the invisible grids, the grids that are always there, even if you don't see them. So the grids that somehow organize the program, and by placing those columns in the center of the spaces, we divide 4 areas. It's a loft, it's a small space. So you have dining, you have cooking, you have living, and you have sleeping. And with this element, you have 4 areas where you can do the functions. We don't say where each function is. We accept that the user will be the one defining it. But it's very important for us that the structure that defines the space for him to occupy, it's defined a priori by ourselves. And sometimes the grid is very dogmatic and it doesn't really work when you want to make all the living rooms and bedrooms and so on the same size. So by bringing motifs, forms, shapes, we correct the parts that were not working. We correct the plan in such a way that the grid is always there, but it can produce an endless amount of possibilities. So you can imagine that depending on the way how you read the space, so this would of course operate in a very close relation with the user, you can define very different spatial conditions starting always from the same room. And the same room can become bigger for a living room, can become smaller for a bedroom, or can even have the structure again exposed, because if you start moving the walls, the structure will end up in the space. But most important, with a very boring, generic, homogeneous grid, the motifs allow you to generate an endless amount of possibilities. And this is also something that interests us a lot, both spatially in terms of the drawings of the plans. How can we make one rigid plan a fluid amount, group of fluid spaces, but at the same time, how we occupy the space later, the same space occupied in many different manners. And we are obsessed with geometries, we are obsessed with alignments, we are obsessed with proportions. We cannot design a project that is not completely, that is not inside a straitjacket, that it's not completely stuck inside its own rules. But at the same time, we are shameless formalists. We have no problem in accepting that. And we believe that, contrary to what Toyo Ito says, his projects had a huge amount of emotion. Like when I see the Kamiwada House main space, I feel something. I cannot agree with this text that says that it's not there. It's actually there. There's a lot. You don't understand the scale. You don't really understand the function. Maybe these morphemes, as he called them, were actually creating some sort of pragmatic problems, like how to organize whatever behind them. But the space is something that cannot be misunderstood. The space is amazing. And our references, they jump between many names, and even in Shinohara, between the first and the fourth style, there are 4 architects, but we can see an endless amount of possibilities in all of them. And as I said, form attracts us. We are very open about it. And Itsuko Asegawa is another of the names we respect a lot. And between an image from the totems from Sotsas and the hand drawings from Peter Markley, there's maybe a million years in distance. But we believe there's a tension between all of this, from the morphemes from Toyo Ito to the rhetorics of Shinohara to the totems from Sotsas, and to the emotion and to the density in the drawings from Peter Markley, that we could bring all together. That's our ambition. Maybe that's where we're going to fail, but that's what we are going to attempt to. There's a possibility of merging all of this together and producing an architecture that we believe is worth living in. And sometimes when we find these kind of scenarios, because if there are some buildings that have a potential, that have an history that should be respected, other times there's nothing. Buildings that have been abandoned for 30 years and rotten, decaying. So we have no anchor points. We have nowhere to start. So we need to create from scratch inside a perimeter. So we have 4 walls that we need to preserve, but we have no content. So form is a solution. Form, morphemes, references, all of them can help us to create something that, again, if we were not there, would never exist. And we test them in many ways. Between 2D drawings, we sketch, we try them in 3D, but there's nothing like the 1-to-1 scale. When this horizon becomes a reality and we have the chance to go there and to feel the space and to understand how close that space is actually to the idea we had when we designed it. And sometimes the back facades, they don't, as I said, they don't follow up to the ambition of the, the front facades cannot be changed, and the back facades, they don't follow up the ambition of the proposals we have in mind for the houses and the apartments. So we need to do something. We need to, again, to question these facades and to express the strength that the front facade doesn't want us to do, doesn't want us to express. And we see that these morphemes from Toyo Ito and these patterns in stone and this kind of strange rhythm in the pattern of the facade, they can all come together and produce something quite unique. And it's unfortunate that we couldn't get the photo without the scaffolding, but I think you get what I mean. This facade is not a back facade. This facade is the main facade, and this facade is defining the tension that the building needs. And for example, this is a house we have now under construction, a refurbishment again, old house with a lot of small rooms, and this was the proposal. You see the 2 floors. The ground floor has a very clear idea. It's a social floor. It's where the kitchen is where the family comes together. It's where, you know, you enter on the corner and you have a private space to put your jacket. Then you can go directly up, or you go to the living room that is focused on the garden, completely open there. That's why the fluid geometry makes perfect sense. But when you go on the 2nd floor, you have a very complicated set of rooms because the building is too short. It's too narrow. It's about 5 meters. So you don't have enough space to have 2 bedrooms on each side. So you need to find a way to operate inside this system. And since we had to add 3 bedrooms, you can see the main bedroom for the couple that owns the house, facing the garden also. The dressing room that needs no light, so it's behind the same curve. And these 2 work as a system. So on one side you feel one side of the curve, and on the other side you feel the other. Then you have the 2 bathrooms that are exactly the same plan, but because you access them both from the same side, on the opposite side of the shape, they are completely different spaces. And then you have this kink that somehow creates some sort of symmetry, but on one side you have the bed for the first kid facing the window, and on the other side you have the desk where the 2nd kid works and does his homework facing the window, and the bed on the inside. So it's funny to see how all of these programs work in pairs, and the geometries that we use to define them create such a contrast with the floor below. So the floor below is fluid, the top one is complicated. It's trying to contrast with what we have below. And you see, this is what you feel on the top, because on the top you even have the slope of the roof to work with. So this is a very complex geometrical construction, and then you have these wood beams that hold the roof exposed, so it's very intricate. And then when you go down, it's fluid. You just have these 2 surfaces and these walls that guide you directly to the outside. Of course, this has an impact on the facade. This is the facade from the garden side, and you see that the ground floor is completely open, so it follows the same logic. It's exposed and it's open to the outside. The top floor that is private is just a punched wall. It has just this window. And the front facade, again, cannot change, but we are trying to find a way to convince the municipality and the clients to bring something from this system that says on the public side of the house that it's part of a more ambitious system than its neighbor. The neighbor is the neighbor, but this one is special. This one is more than just that. Vertical elements. Since the Izumo Shrine, Japanese architecture has been wondering about the theme of the symbolical central structural column. And Shinohara has been struggling on where to place it, because in many of his projects, mostly in his first style, the square house with a central column had many variations and many different meanings. And even his disciple, Sakamoto, was also struggling with that discussion in his first house. So when we designed our first house, the one that doesn't like the context in which it's settling in, the central column became an important theme for us. So we didn't need that column. The living room is very clear, so you enter on the left, you have this curve that guides you to the living space where the main window is facing the garden, and then you have the kitchen in the back. You have 3 bedrooms, 1 on each corner, and there's a kitchen there more, in a more private area, so that the living room is completely open. But it felt fundamental for us that there would be this element that would somehow give a hierarchy to the space. And when the clients told us that they wanted to divide the kitchen from the living room, we actually saw an opportunity to justify this column, to actually avoid a wall, avoid those wood panels that no one really likes in the end, to avoid putting a gigantic cabinet that would kill this main space. And the column was the minimal element we found. And what we felt was that this column is not structural, it's not holding anything. So if this column would touch the ceiling, it would be sending mixed signals, you know, it's touching the ceiling, so it's actually necessary, and it would feel like a mistake, like someone put a column there because they could not solve the column in a better way. So we decided to stop the column 20 centimeters before the ceiling. So this way it's very clear that that column is just a piece of architecture, it's not a piece of structure. That column is not there to hold anything other than the spatial structure of this room. And the house is now under construction, it should be finished before Christmas. And what is fascinating for us was, in one of our site visits, we took this photo, and this is the column that is holding the building. This is a column that is hidden inside a wall, that no one will ever see, that is actually holding that gigantic concrete roof. And this is the shoe of that column. This is the shoe of the column that holds the architecture of the house. It's almost invisible. It's almost irrelevant, one might say. And you can imagine the kind of discussions we had with the contractor to explain that that column was very, very important because he could not get it. And today the concrete is already up, and it's nice to see there, but the small column was not cast yet, but you feel that there's this very strong, oversized column to hold engineering. But then for architecture, you need so little to do the same. And this theme became very, very, very important for us, this trope, this idea of the central column that defines hierarchies. So in the houses that followed, this element became more and more present in different ways. Sometimes in the form, let's say, an expression of a column, other times with the expression of a post, but it felt so necessary in all of these projects. And when we were faced with this one again, where the space was just absolute. It needed some hierarchy. You cannot just give a room and tell people, do whatever you want. The column became crucial for us. So this column that is standing right in the center of the room and helps to organize the directions of the pavement so that it's even more clear, almost didactic to the user, that the table is one side, the kitchen is another one, the sofa is in another one, and the bed is going to be in another one. Because these are the key furniture pieces that every house or every studio usually has. So, I mean, it's funny if they do one of these quadrants as a gallery space, or if they paint there, or one is just to read, or the other one is just to, you know, to write. But what is very important is that they understand they have these 4 areas, and this is not a room with 5 spaces, or a room with 1 space, or a room with 3 spaces. It has 4. And again, we felt that this was an opportunity to have a very clear understanding of what the column is, and again, the column doesn't touch the ceiling, because again, it's a column that is just expressing an architectural value, not a structural one. Meaning spaces. Meaning spaces was, and you can see it's between comments, was an expression from that several Japanese architects were talking about in the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And it's a theme that truly, truly amazes us. This idea that a house can be built all around one core space. One space that means more than anything else. One space that is the reason for the house to be there, more than the users, more than the functions you would do in the house. And this is one of the best examples, the White Hue from Toyoito, probably the best house from the 20th century. And the house is built around such a strong idea, about such a personal idea. It's built for his sister. And it's such a fantastic project. But it was not the only one. The Kamiwada house, again, was fighting the same battle. This idea that there would be secondary programs on the corners, but the center of the house was very special. And again, no windows. It was really, really about how the light would come into this kind of cavern-like space. And the way how he explains it, and how he rationally explains the plan that should have been there and the plan that was actually there, including this kind of in-between moment of the transition between the 2 sides of symbolical space. It's fantastic. And Shinohara was doing the same thing in his second style. He was designing houses that were 100% focused on one main space. The whole house is about this space, and the other programs are just around to make the house work. So the bedrooms and the bathrooms and the kitchen, they don't really matter. And most of the times, these spaces were not living rooms. They were just spaces, meaning spaces. So you would have maybe a chair, you would have maybe a painting there, and that's it. So this was a space that was living from being just special. That's it. There was no specific function, traditional function that we usually see in every room, in a plan, in any house we study. And on his third style, he moved to a more radical direction, and he started placing structural elements that were not so obvious, both because of their dimensions, their placement. Even if you see the direction of the column and the direction of the beams, it's not perpendicular to the roof. So nothing was very, very logical. It was very, very symbolical. And at this period in Japan, there were several architects working these very symbolical spaces. And this is actually part of the proposal we are doing for the next Chicago Biennial, about the study on how these houses were all different houses built by different architects. At least in this group, there are 4 different architects, but at the same time, they feel like they could be all part of the same office. Like the same person could have been doing all of these houses, which is very fascinating. Different personas with different ages. Some of them worked with each other. Some of them were the bosses of one another. But far away from each other, they produced these 9 and a few more houses that were somehow so close to be the same. And when we find ourselves trapped inside these very unappealing refurbishments, we need to find ourselves some sort of interest, some sort of angle that makes the project fascinating. And as you can see, this is a 60 square meters apartment, lots of rooms, small rooms. The kitchen is in the back, the living room is in the front, the bathroom is in the patio. There's a bedroom without windows, there's a bedroom that is too small, there's a big corridor that, makes no sense. So it's very clear for us that the idea for the space, it's there. You have 2 bedrooms, you have these niches, you put the program there, and then you connect the 2 facades. But even after deciding that this is the idea we're going to work with, there's 1 million different ways to make that main space, that living room special, to make it work. Because any of this would have exactly the same idea, but the meaning we wanted was only found in the last one, the bottom right. And when we created these systems, then there's this game where everything didactically, rhetorically helps us to distinguish them. So the grids of the pavements, they go in different directions. The materials are different. On one side, you have private programs. On the other side, you have the public ones. On one side, you have wood that is very warm. On the other side, you have stone that is very cold. And the collage tries to express that. The collage tries to focus solely on the main space. The secondary spaces, they are secondary. And this collage tries to go as close as possible to the built space. But more important than that, the built space helps us to prove if the collage worked or not, because the collage, together with the plan, reveals the architecture. But this photo is more important because it makes this one say that it worked. This is the proof that that one worked. And that's very important for us, because many times we produce we produce projects that will not be built, that will not happen. So if this apartment was never built, this was the last stage of its architecture. So it's very, very important that, that it makes perfect sense. And we like many times to do these axos where we see the apartment and then we extract from it just that space. And in this case, these 5 doors that look like that are hand-painted pieces of plywood that are slightly detached from the floor. They give an elevation to the living room that again makes it special. We could have found many different ways to solve it, probably a few that were better, a few that were worse, but it makes the space special somehow. And the first house we designed, again, from the outside, I could talk about it, but not now. But on the inside, it's very practical. You saw the plan. There's we call it the house for 3 generations. So in each corner, there's a room, a bedroom and a bathroom, and the parents live in one side, the daughter lives in another one, and the grandparents live in another one. And what they told us is that they didn't want to share any private spaces, they want to have some independence. But then they would want to go and gather on the center. And they would like to have the chance to have a space where they could all come together to have the meals, to talk, to watch TV. And that's what we try to give them. So by making these free shapes somehow illogical, let's say, or arbitrary, what we defined was an eccentric living area. Because the bedrooms, they were not that much affected, but the living area, the more eccentric each of these shapes would be, the more eccentric that space would be. And this was our first house, so it was very important for us that these two themes, the vertical element and the meaning space, were somehow defining the whole structure of the house. So the whole architecture of the house is sustained by these two elements. And as you can see, the square somehow represents the family. The square represents the family. Each one of these shapes represents one of the generations, and we didn't choose who would take each bedroom. We just made a model, we open it, and we let them talk. And in 5 minutes, they decided which one would take each bedroom. It was fantastic to see, because they understood the idea. Because they never saw any plan until the day we showed them the model. And when we opened the model, in seconds, they got it. Because the idea was following what they asked for. They didn't ask for a shape, they just asked for some sort of mental construction for the house. In seconds, they just selected the spaces they wanted to live in. And as I said, the more eccentric each one of these was, the more special this space would be. So once they selected the bedrooms they wanted to have, the resulting space was somehow a reflection of their personality. So each one of them selected the personality that would fit each, let's say, each generation. And then the space that results from the subtraction from the family unit, from these free corner spaces is, it's the personality of the family somehow. And you see here you see the column that actually holds everything together. And this is the column that will hold the architecture together. Portraits. We use collages as a working tool, but we use collages as a lens. On a technical level, the collage has many ups and downs, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. But we can talk about it as a technique. We can talk about it as a way of doing an image, and I will address it. But we can also talk about it as a way in which we can look at the world, as a way in which we can propose an image of the world. So for us, the collage is simultaneously a tool and a way of thinking architecture. But the collage is never alone. As I said, we always start with the plan. The plan dictates rules, and until the plan is not somehow existing, there is no collage, because the collage is the perfect counterpoint to the plan. The plan, as I said, narrates facts. It's measurable, it's dry, you can discuss it with the client, and the client can disagree with you, and even we can disagree about something on a plan, and we can explain why, because it's too big, too narrow, too tall. But the collage, no. The collage, because it comes as a result of a certain plan, of a certain idea of architecture, the collage is like a punch in the face. Either you accept it, either you deal with it, or you reject it completely. It has, it deals with your guts. It deals with something that is visceral, something that you cannot really rationally explain. It's either yes or no. And it's fantastic when we have the chance to talk with other architects, when we talk among each other in the office, when we talk with clients, and the collage somehow proves to make so much sense. They get it. They completely understand it. And the collages, they help us to work in a limbo, to propose exactly what we're going to have there, but it's not exactly what we're going to have there. So we need to have our own references for this, and we are very much obsessed with David Hockney, not only because he narrates or he provides an endless library. We know that. Every architecture student knows that. David Hockney paintings, they are very catchy, and you can use those objects to produce beautiful, beautiful compositions. But what attracts us the most about David Hockney is both the way how he could expose, how he could throw a lifestyle into an image. You know, like you see nothing about this living room. You know nothing other than there's a window that is probably leading to a balcony that has a garden in front. This is everything you know about the space in this room. But there's such a tension. The way how these two people are looking at the painter, it's fantastic. And the way how these small objects suggest that they are relaxed. The guy has no shoes. There's a book on the table. The book has a yellow cover. There's a painting. So there's so much there. But at the same time, you know so little. And because you know so little, Hockney proves that when someone sees a collage, they get it, but they don't really get it. So this limbo is very important for us. But all of these images from Hockney, they were completely planned like a Jeff Wall photo would be. Jeff Wall's career is fantastic. All these photos were somehow programmed, and he could, in each image, he would prepare each object, each, you know, the domestic scenes, each piece of fruit, each chair on the floor. They were specifically programmed to bring that place. You would spend days preparing them, months, so that a certain message, a certain tension would pass through. And in this one, where you see him and you see the photographic camera in the background, the message is even higher. You know, there's something about this image that, you know, we cannot stop relating with David Hockney. And the tension between these two is what we try to expose in our photos, in our collages, I mean. We want to express this kind of planned lifestyle composition. You know, everything is there for a specific reason, for a specific purpose. And our images, I mean, I could show this space with nothing. I could show this space just with the two windows and the wood floor, and that's it. But there is a tension in the user and the way how we look at the space being used that makes it completely different. It's like looking at a dress and looking at someone wearing a dress. It's not the same thing. And as you see, we never really know what is happening. Are these friends? Is this a couple? Is this guy also in the same room as the previous two, or is he just someone else in a different room? What is this guy? Why is this guy looking at the camera like this? Where did he go now? Where is the cat? The cat disappeared. I mean, this kind of research led us to now be questioning even the whole concept of perspective. So how to build an image that is not a perspective anymore, how to build an image from surfaces, from the objects that we will use to build actual building. But as I said, we always start with a plan. And as a technique, the collage makes sense once we get more or less to this stage. Once we get to the point where we have 5, 10 ideas in our minds and we need to test them to the next level. So when there's already something. And the collage shows up in a very blunt way. It just helps us to put a couple of objects in space, a new wall, a colored element, a piece of furniture, some sort of activity, and we see something there. We also do 3D modeling. We test it. Because the 3D modeling is the opposite of the collage. It's very precise. If it says 3 meters, it's 3 meters. In the collage, 3 meters can be 10 or can be 2. It doesn't really make a difference. But in the 3D model, we can check if the proportions are actually working. And then the collage comes back again with more detail. And the plans keep evolving. And there are some models showing up. And we, at this stage, we bring the client in. We bring the materials, we bring the samples, we make proposals, we bring textures. So everything that we are learning from the real scale, from the real world, we are bringing back to the collage. So if we're going to propose these curtains, we need that texture from the curtain to be the same in the image we are going to propose. And again, if we're going to propose a space that is occupied like a gallery in this case, we make all the pieces, including the furniture, including the kitchen, that is, of course, it's fixed, you cannot move the kitchen, to feel like we could move it. So the whole proposal is about not changing the space at all, and then inhabiting it like we inhabited the collage. Every single piece of furniture needs to feel like I could take it away and put it on the other corner of the room and it still works, nothing changed. So if you have this white background, the color elements in the space do that quite well. And even the things you cannot move, as I was saying, the kitchen, the hood, you cannot move those. But they feel like if I wanted to move it 2 meters to the side, I could do it. And that's what I meant by living in the collage. And that's what we proposed to the clients. And as I said, they were very open-minded and they accepted this idea. And when they were buying the furniture, it was very interesting to see how they somehow assimilated what we had in mind, and we discussed it again, and the colors, the pieces, everything was coming together in a very nice manner. And it's a garage house, so it's always nice to have a car inside. And this is what I'm talking about, that this photo shows nothing. You know nothing. If I show you just this, you have no idea what you're looking at, but it shows so much at the same time. There's a bed and there's a sofa, which suggests intimacy, private space. At the same time, there's a car, which might confuse you. You see a curtain that suggests that you can somehow isolate spaces. There's that plant, and there's those two boxes on the side that I don't really know what they are. There's so much information, and at the same time, there's nothing at all. It's quite interesting for us to see it. And whiteness. A collage usually starts with the background, and the background is most of the times for us white. It's a white surface. But it's not the same white from Shinohara, for example. This is probably the most famous photo from the House in White. And there's such a tension here, because you have all of these elements. This column is actually the center of a square, although the fake ceiling might hide that fact. But again, you see all of these hints at domesticity, but the space itself is very almost generic. There's no real formal trick to make it special other than this structural element and the objects you put in space. So it's for us very important that when we do collage, we could do them like this. And if we turn off all the layers, we would probably get to that. But it's important that we show it occupied, that we actually show the space as it will be, because houses have people living in them. They have dogs, they have tables, they have, trash. And it's very, very important to bring, again, the tension from David Hockney to this white background. But again, the background is always white because it allows us to detach from it a series of objects. And as you probably noticed, many of our proposals have the objects detached from the architecture. And again, the collage, in contrast to the photo, it's always nice to see the two before and after. And sometimes the project itself becomes a kind of manifesto of this white room, white background proposal filled with color. When you look at the space and you understand that there was nothing done there, actually there was, all these walls were built, but it feels like nothing happened. We are taking the pressure from the room. We are taking the pressure from the architecture, both in these shops, for example, and putting all the pressure in the elements that will organize the function and that will organize the space. And when you look at the space frontally, you would get a feeling, but when you move around, you would get another one, which you cannot do with the collage. The collage is usually very flat, but with photographs, you can really show the three-dimensionality. And again, the first stage is understanding the space as it is, proposing the space we imagine, and then the photo helps us to prove if that collage actually worked out or not. And there are many kinds of white, and I doubt that our white is not connected to the Shinohara one or the Sisa one or Sejima's one, but it's at the same time it's neither of them. So it's a little bit of all of them, but it's not the same. So the same white background can somehow suggest different uses, and when we study in detail, for example, these three authors, it's very clear to understand that white means very different things for the three of them, and we don't see ourselves in any of these three definitions. And we have the absolute counterpoint. So if we have the background, if we have this white starting point, we have the objects on top. We cannot see our spaces without them. It's very, very difficult. And this is, for example, the new office, actually the apartment on top of the new office we will have soon. And even for ourselves, this is a space we will inhabit. We feel the need to express how we will inhabit it. Not only in terms of the color of the pavement, the detail of the door, the proportions of the doors, but even in the objects that will occupy it. I swear this is real. We are discussing the dog we're going to buy based on this collage. It's really happening. And again, because it's ours, it's a trap, because we tend to be, what we propose is not always what we want for ourselves. But we are actually learning a lot from this process, because we're understanding that we are more dogmatic about it than we actually imagine, and we are working for ourselves the same way as we work for others. And color on top of a white background is very important. So when you have the white background, color becomes a tool that allows us to quickly detach, to quickly say that there was a white space that was refurbished. Everything here is new, but when you look at it, you feel that the white was always there, just the blue elements were added. And there was a phase in the beginning where blue was an obsession of ours, because it's commonly accepted. It's the color that everyone relates to. It's a color that everyone accepts. But with time, we became more experimental, and there was a moment where we were intrigued by this combination of green and pink, and now we are doing projects where only pink remains, and we are curious to see where this is going to lead us after, because the choice of colors is very personal in a way, but at the same time it has a very clear intention, so we are very curious to see where this is going to lead us. And this is the material that we are mostly fascinated with, marble. Marble is very affordable in Portugal. It's a very luxurious material, but not that expensive. And it's the perfect opposite to the white wall, because it has a soul. Each stone has a personality. It has a different color, different pattern. You don't have two stones that look alike. And when you play with it, you see it has different colors, some of them with a lot of noise, others almost flush. You can work the texture, but you can also work the finishing. It can be very polished, it can be almost matte. It can be, kind of scratched. And it allows us to work in different ways, because when you have the white background and you have the color has always a sense of abstraction. The color is somehow just the color. Even if in this case it's painting plywood and you see the veins of the wood. But when you bring marble, marble is not like that. Marble can be perfectly flush, so it has no texture whatsoever, but it has so much soul. It's like if each stone is talking to you. When the three of them come together, we believe we find something that is quite unique. This background with this pavement, with these colored elements, it's very, very nice. And even when you use it in smaller elements, like a piece of furniture, it's so nice to feel that it's such a heavy stone, it's such a heavy material standing on top of such a light metal structure. It's a very nice material to work with, and it has a strong personality. Like, you look at these stones and they feel so heavy, but when, as I said, when you move around, you feel that they are so thin. They are 2 centimeters. They are very, very, very thin. And even when you produce a completely flat facade, so a facade that has, except for the 2 windows, it's just a surface. It allows us, by using different kinds of stone, to project such a depth into it. And the way how the pattern is prepared and the way how the different sizes are hierarchized so that you can generate something special. It's so much easier when you use marble. And this is how we think the occupation. So we have the white background, and not only we do collages, we render, as I said, and we sketch on top of the renders, and then we try them in collage, and then we could do this, or we could do what we do. So we could just show the space empty or the space occupied, but by far we always prefer to show it with life. It's much closer to what it's going to be in reality. And these are many of our projects currently under construction that none of them is the same, but you can see there are some themes that are repeated, some colors, some motifs, some forms, but it's never the same, but it's somehow always the same, which is quite nice. And collage versus construction. So at some point there's this debate between which one came first, the egg and the chicken. And in the beginning for us it was very clear, the project comes always before the collage, and the idea would come always before. But it became confusing at some point that we could not really understand what was happening, if our architecture was being defined by the collage or if our collages were being defined by the architecture. This was one of the first competitions we did in Switzerland, where we had an elementary school, and you can see that this is the whole site. So we pretty much grabbed the site that was much bigger than the building needed to be. And on that side, we built this perimeter wall, and the wall is made out of brick, and we built a wood structure. Like, if we could detach this, we could just demolish the brick wall, and the building would still work out. The school would be still there. But it was so important for us to show that there were these 2 layers in the proposal. The layer where you define the school, and it's warm, it's wood, it's very comfortable. And it relates to the courtyard, but you always feel protected here, and didactically, of course, we expose the structure. And the wall, that is the complete opposite. It's somehow generic, it's cold, it's brick, it's a material that is so different from the one you have on the inside. But the 2 of them together create the building. The two of them isolated mean very little, but the two of them together create the building, and this way we use the wall to grab the courtyard as a piece of the architecture, as a part of the architecture. And other times, like in this apartment where we have a very big room, and we wanted to keep it as such, but at the same time there's the need to create areas, because as you notice in several of these big studios, there are functions that you don't really want to eat next to your bedside table. You want to have sometimes certain degrees of privacy. So this idea of building a space with layers, with like a collage, let's say, became almost literal. And since we had a chance to go on site and to visit the space and to do this kind of mock-ups, it was very nice for us to see that in reality, this three-dimensionality that, you know, when you move the space, you feel comes from a very flat construction of space. And depending on where you are, only the amount of natural light suggests how much privacy you have or not. So I can imagine the bed on this side and the sofa on the other side, but maybe someone else is going to do something else. Maybe someone is going to paint on that side, read on this side, and sleep on that corner, and we don't know. So it's very open, and that's why when we were trying to produce the collages for this space, we didn't really want to suggest where we were looking at. So we don't know exactly where I'm looking at. Am I on the right side or the left side, looking in which direction? But it's very nice for us to see that it's possible to actually build a project from the same perspective we produce a collage. And this is the building that I showed before with that grid that has shapes intersecting it. And at some point, this idea of the egg and the chicken goes so far that we start reading the buildings as a collage themselves. This building is a collage. You have so many rooms, and all the rooms have these different doors. It seems like someone had a lot of fun in the past, but it's just time. As time passed, this building kept having interventions and interventions and interventions. And the final result is a very funny group of similar rooms with different openings. And I mean, this one is very nice because on the other side, you imagine you have 3 rooms, but it's actually only 1 room on each side. So the 3 doors take you to the same place. So we started not only producing collages to express our ideas, to project our buildings as collages, and even to read the buildings we intervene in as collages themselves. So you see that these are 4 different rooms that I think all of them exist in the proposal, but if they don't, it's not really a problem. If suddenly the doors start changing and the proportion is not exactly the same, it's perfectly fine. And of course, this is how we always imagine them. But again, if the function changes, it's perfectly acceptable. Or if the way how we build also becomes a collage itself. So if this facade, this stone facade, comes out and there's a metal element in front of it that will allow us to do a glass facade, it's very nice to see how, you see, there's the existing wall that will remain, there's the new structure, and inside you have the elements of the new structure and the old structure. Everything is going to remain. What we can keep, we will keep. What we can't, we will add with metal beams. And this almost feels like a Photoshop file. It really feels like we had this, and we started turning on and off most of the layers. And at some point, this was one possible scenario. Like, we forgot to turn on one of the folders, and then suddenly the space looks like this. And it's very nice because the whole construction is trying to target a kind of deconstructivist appearance. We could have a white ceiling. We could just put some gypsum, and the ceiling would be the same as always. But this building was so special in the way how these tree trunks and this new structure would have to come together that we felt that exposing it would be a very interesting thing to do. And of course, then the forms collide with it. So you have these different systems. You have the programmatic system that is overlaid with this form, that is overlaid with the construction that is somehow exposed, that is overlaid with the textures that are very different from each other. Like usually you have this white layer and the floor, but this you have the white layer, you have green, you have metal, you have wood, you have a wood pavement, you have pink. It's very, very expressive and more of the same. Final topic, elevations. As I said many times, the front facade is not where we can be the most creative. We have to preserve it. And the back facade is where we do exactly the opposite. It's where we try to find a new expression for the building, to give the building not only a new space on the inside, but a new a new address, let's say. But this leads us to even question at some point which of this is actually facing the street side, which of this is where the mailman is going to leave the letter, and which of this is completely private. And I think this is a very good example of that, where the back facade was treated in such a special way that it's really unclear if it's really okay to call it a back facade. But we produce facades the same way as we produce the plans. We are very rhetorical about them. We are very almost dogmatic. If they don't follow a series of rules, alignments, proportions, etc., they don't make sense. So even when we have a strong idea for them, it's very important for us that then we can combine that idea with all the rhetorics that comes from behind. But at the same time, we see the facades as an opportunity to somehow bring a new layer of information to the project. So if the plan defines a sense of logic, hierarchy, program, and rhetoric, and the collage shows you something about the expression of the space and how you will feel inside it, the facade is, as I said, is a public manifesto. It says something about how we want our architecture to feel towards the city. It's somehow urban. And sometimes it even contains this kind of private jokes where the house is a factory and the factory is a house and so on. This was the first facade, the first house and the first facade we are now building from scratch. It's our first house. And it's very special as a house because, as I said during the presentation, it's the first one. It has this very strong meaning space in the center. There is this column that doesn't touch the ceiling that makes it so annoying. There is a very strong tectonic to it. It's the concrete. It's being exposed. It's being cast in situ. In situ. It feels very, very heavy as a house. But the facade just follows a system. You see that some of the facades are even the same, and we feel the need to put this golden sheet just to symbolize which one is the main door and which one is the kitchen door. But what we like the most about it is that this facade is, this building is in a context that we don't really care so much about, as I said in the beginning, and it suggests not only this urban manifesto we were talking about, but it suggests also something about our architecture, how the naiveness comes to the face of a house, how this house somehow feels like she's saying hello to the neighbors, how contrary to the neighbors that are somehow enclosed and, you know, they always respect the same rules, but they are very egocentric, they are self-centered. This one is just open to the public, which is ironic, knowing that it follows an alignment that is not respectful at all to the site. And that's very special for us, to be able to design something that, while built from scratch, can have a completely different relation to the public from a building that we are just correcting. This is the last image. It's a building. It's the first public building we are building, and it's not. I mean, it's not really a building. It's a pavilion for an exhibition in Serralves in Porto, and again, it follows somehow a similar logic from the Marco house, from the previous house. It has a few elements that suggest use, like those beams that suggest structural necessity, that opening that suggests that, you know, there's something on the inside we should get in, but at the same time it's further away from being logical. It's further away from being understandable. I don't really know from this image what it is, what is on the inside, how should I deal with this building? And when you go around and you see the opposite corner, you have another of these doors that is very, very tall. Both of the doors have this black marble element that symbolizes, the entrance from far. Then there's this red element that is a structural element crossing the building. It's a very complex composition, but it's not a didactical one. And I think it's interesting when the architecture gets to this point that you notice that I use the word rhetoric and didactic so many times today, but in the end it can be just fluid, and this is a very fluid facade in that sense. It's just natural. It came out very natural, and it has it's very tense, but it's not logical. It's a mix of many things, like the architecture we hope to produce. So, as a kind of conclusion, I think that it's important to say that architecture, for us at least, is an act of curation. As I said, we spend most of our time collecting, grabbing more and more and more from the real, and then digesting and processing and proposing it back in new forms. But when you go to our website, this is just a print screen from the website, it feels like it's a schizophrenic website. It's very consistent in a way, but at the same time, not at all. There are references that go from, you know, the tall Miesian skyscraper in the US to the most humble birdhouse in somewhere else. It shows you a lot of domestic scenes. At the same time, it shows you a lot of urban facades. It's a little bit of many things, and it's more or less where we are right now. As I said in the beginning, we are in a checkpoint right now. We are trying to understand what we achieved so far. We are trying to understand what we want to achieve from now on. And we hope that a lecture like the one we are holding today is let's say, a tool that will allow us to continue this clarification process. The same applies to the book, to future lectures, teaching, etc. And we would like to finish with this sentence that is a kind of transformation or adaptation. Let's call it a refurbishment from Bjork's version, where architecture is a smart, sophisticated game where everything becomes a quotation from something else. Thank you so much.
That was a really thought-provoking lecture, especially to situate the work, I think, within a kind of ideological context of references, but also in terms of your working methods, which was really generous, I think, to share with all of us. I just wanted to check if anyone in the audience has any questions that they want to ask in this more formal format. Otherwise, we can all have drinks and you can chat more informally. Just if anyone has a question, if you raise your hand, I'll give you the microphone.
Drink series?
I'm going to ask a question because I lived in Japan as well for 2 years, so I know kind of the feeling of coming from Japan and wanting to work with this kind of utopian idea of like this Japanese architecture, which is really overwhelming in the beginning and then you get into it, but how do you actually use it in contemporary architecture, especially in Europe? The contrast is very different. But you mentioned like the main pole you use in the projects, and then this one you have the structural one, and then next to it you have the architectural one. But how do you relate that to the Japanese traditional architecture, where you actually have the odaiba, the only pole, and then you have the hiroma and the doma, the earth floor, and the... So actually it's something very contradictory you do, but it has a lot of meaning. So I don't know, how do you reflect on that, or how sensitive are you to the Japanese traditional architecture then using this?
Okay, answering very quickly. One thing that Filipe said before is that, for example, the whiteness of Japan is not exactly the whiteness that we use. And even the elements like the column that is quite commonly used in Japan, it's not exactly the same way we used it. So for sure it influenced us, but it's not our only reference. Japan is not our only reference. It was a very important one because Japan is different from Asia, even different from Europe. It's something completely outstanding. But when you, of course, transport it to our reality, and when you mix it with other references, it gains other meanings.
The Daikokobashira column, the one with the meaning, it's a complicated word. It's a structural column that is usually located at the center of the building, and it has this symbolism. It's very, very symbolical. And in that sense, what I said about the Bramante reference, that you don't actually bring the form, you bring the meaning of that column. We see the column in the center of that living room as the symbolical Japanese column, even if it's not really holding the roof. So the meaning for us is the same, although the actual result is something else. So it's holding something that you can understand, because you always see the daikakobashira. But the column that is inside a wall means nothing. That column is as relevant as the rest of the structure. Did you notice the rest of the structure? No, it's the same. So it's very important for us to detach one from the other. The two of them are funny because right now you can see both, and it's so ironic. But in the end, one is very, very relevant. The other one is just invisible.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank all three of you for being here today and also for the terrific lecture. And hopefully now we can all have some drinks and chat more.
Let's go for it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.